Chinatown, crowded streets, bustling and bright, alive with tourists and everyday traffic. This is our image of Chinatown today. But in days long gone, this was Chinatown, a close, quiet community that non-Chinese rarely saw. This is a portrait of one such Chinatown, a Chinatown which no longer exists. They came with hope. Thousands of Chinese immigrants in the mid-1800s, weathering the grim voyage to find a better life in the land they called Golden Mountain. Many worked on the railroad, others mined for gold. Some were drawn to the fertile Santa Clara Valley, where the need for farm labor was great. San Jose, like other cities in the valley, soon had a Chinatown, a home base for the immigrants in a new and sometimes unfriendly world. In the 1870s, the country was hit by depression. Hostility towards Chinese erupted. Whites attacked the Yellow Horde as a threat to their jobs and to society in general. In 1887, to chase the Chinese out, arsonists set San Jose Chinatown ablaze. Panicked residents rushed to the water tower, only to find it empty. A crowd stood by as hundreds of Chinese lost their homes. When the smoke cleared, one figure came forth to aid the Chinese, an independent thinking landowner named John Heinlen. Just 15 days after the fire, Heinlen announced his plan to help the Chinese build a new Chinatown. Battling public outrage and attacks by the city leaders, Heinlen leased to the Chinese at low rates a settlement on the edge of town. The new Chinatown was christened Heinlenville. It was built to be a safe haven from the hostile community outside. A protective fence circled the town. The Chinese hired a watchman to lock it each night. The new Ngxinggung Temple, the community center, was the symbol of Heinlenville, built by the Chinese themselves of solid brick so that it could not be burned down again. Though they struggled to make ends meet, the Chinese found a life of security within the protective walls of Heinlenville.
It was a small community. Most of the families all knew each other, knew what happened to each family, and knew who had a new kid on the block, or a small community, but a very close-knit one.
We very seldom see Caucasians inside of Heinlenville. That's mostly the Chinese. Their whole family play with each other, talk to each other. They shop there and they go back home, which is within Heinlenville itself.
The Chinese farm workers again had a safe place to stay, rooming in the back of Heinlenville stores between stints on the farms.
And those stores would be normally used by these farm workers, like headquarters. Off-season, they have a place to go, they have a place to receive their mail. Now, one of the most important things in those times were receive mail from the families in China.
Immigration laws prohibited Chinese workers from bringing wives with them to America, creating largely a bachelor society of men in Chinatown.
All these are single men. There's no families. And they just wait out the season until the next season comes around.
The farm workers supported Heinlenville's businesses, its herb shops, general stores, and its gambling establishments, one of the only forms of entertainment available to the bachelor society. Gambling was also one of the few businesses open to Chinese.
Most of the adult male in San Jose were either into the gambling business, or they would own a restaurant, or they would be working as a private family cook or something like that. But other than that, there was really no other kind of occupation that they had the opportunity to go into.
My father was in the lottery. He had a little store in San Jose in lottery. I think it was 2nd and Julian Street, as I recall. He had a little store there. And then later on, we were printing lottery tickets also. And that's what my father did for a living.
Why is there so much gambling in Chinatown? In those days, like I say, most of the people, Chinese, were migrant workers. There's one place where they can always mix together, I think, is in a gambling house. I don't consider it a sin, because the only people that can are spending money are the Chinese or the Japanese, more or less like a social thing in a sense. So we never given any thought. Of course, we don't gamble. I don't think any of us kids grew up there ever became doing any of that type of gambling at all.
Local government and police neglected Chinatown, giving rise to the Tongs, governing associations that made their own laws.
Now, these Tongs are what they would like to be called as a fraternal organization, but they are more than that. They are the strong arm, I would say, in those days anyway.
The Tongs are for, well, you can say Chamber of Commerce if you like, because if you're not in the right Tong, you can't go into a certain type of business, say a restaurant business or something like that, or whatever the other business may be. And in those days, it's just like a union. You don't belong to the right one, you're not going to go into that type of business.
In day-to-day life, the community devoted itself to preserving the peaceful traditions of its culture. The temple, or Joss House, was the beacon of community life for the San Jose Chinese. It was the religious and social center and a place for all celebrations.
We had some holidays, Chinese holidays, which I've never heard of anywhere else, what we call Daqiu.
Chinese from all over California came to San Jose Chinatown to celebrate the elaborate week-long festival of Daqiu.
This festival is a celebration of the immortals, paying homage to those who have gone before us. San Jose is a Chinese community that retains a lot of the old customs.
The temple was also the place for another vital cultural tradition, Chinese school.
The Chinese regarded in my time, it's very important to learn the language, and they stress it in no uncertain terms. Every Chinese children attended the school, unless they lived very far away.
But as Chinatown faithfully preserved the old culture, a new culture was gradually emerging, the first generation of American-born Chinese. While their parents still felt the sting of past attacks, the children of Heinlenville began to bridge the cultures of the inside and outside worlds with ease. After 1910, The fence around the town was no longer locked. In World War I, San Jose Chinatown even boasted its own local hero, Sing Gi, the first Chinese in the war to be cited for extraordinary bravery. Back at home, the Chinatown kids were going to American school.
There were very few Orientals that went to grant school, a small group, that's all. But we got along with them, and they accepted us very well, being Chinese.
I don't remember any so-called racial incidents or anything like that, because the biggest thing is we attended school together, we played together. Oh, there might be isolated fist fights and like Art, for instance. This is off the record. I was coming home from school one day in grammar school, and Art said, "Hey, this guy called me a chink, go beat him up." And I got beat up. But we got along very nicely. Maybe we're so close and going to school together. Never gave it a thought.
Although the second generation enjoyed a protected childhood, the Heinlenville community was severely affected by discrimination and economic hardship. By the 1920s, Chinatown began to fade. Congress passed laws cutting off Chinese immigration completely, and Heinlenville's bachelor society of migrant workers began to die out. Without the farm workers, Chinatown's economy declined. The second generation began to seek opportunities beyond Chinatown.
We moved out, find a little better place to live, and as we move out, nobody would move into the shacks, and one by one they boarded up, and pretty soon nobody there at all.
In 1931, the Heinlen estate went bankrupt. Soon, all that remained of Heinlenville was Ng Seng Kung, the Joss House. For 18 years, it stood alone as the last symbol of Chinatown. But in 1949, it too was threatened.
They had a firehouse built right next to the Joss House, and they claimed that it was hazardous to the firehouse, so they tore Joss House down. That was the last of Heinlenville. And then the city took it over as a repair yard for the automobiles. And that's it. There's nothing left there now at all.
Opponents of the demolition managed to save only the temple altar, which was dismantled and put in storage, where it would remain for 4 decades. In 1987, the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project united the Chinese community to preserve the history of the lost town, a plan proposed by the Chinese American Women's Club of Santa Clara County. Under CHCP, volunteers restored the temple altar. In 1991, their efforts made the resurrection of Ng Seng Kung Temple, the symbol of the last San Jose Chinatown, a reality. Now there is a place to remember a town, erected in fear, that thrived on community. A town that respected the past, but looked to the future. A town of determined immigrants who raised a confident new generation of Americans. A town that was once called Heinlenville.
I think the fact that I lived in Chinatown made me more resourceful. When I say resourceful, is that if I got into any situation today, I'd find some way to get out of it. I think for the most part, the kids that I grew up with would feel the same way.
As far as I'm concerned, every kid should live that way. To me, that was the greatest time of my life. Of course, we always reminisce. You can't go back. There's no way you can go back. But it's nice. It's not always nice. It's a good life.